All right, everybody. Happy Tuesday. We're going to continue on with World War II today and kind of get more specifically today talking about kind of a more difficult topic. We're going to be talking primarily today about the Holocaust and the effects of the Holocaust on um, Germany, and the rest of the world because really, the Holocaust is one of the worst things, worst atrocities that's ever happened in the history of mankind. And it's important to note, just how horrible this was, because it's what defines really Nazi Germany. It's what defines Hitler and what gives him, this status as, according to many people, pretty much the worst person that's ever lived because of the horrible atrocities that took place. So we're going to get into the Holocaust a little bit, and that's really going to be the main thing we're talking about here today. So we'll get right. Um, so what was the Holocaust? Now, when we think of the Holocaust, we think of the slaughter of Jewish people, and certainly it was the Jewish people that faced the worst of the Holocaust. In Germany and surrounding countries, 6 million 6 million Jews were rounded up and exterminated ultimately. Many more were rounded up than even the 6 million, but um, it didn't just end with um, the Jewish people. Remember, Hitler believed in Aryan supremacy. He believed that this Third Reich he was creating was a 1,000-year Reich, and Germany was going to rule over the world for 1,000 years of peace, or at least peace as they saw it. And what the Holocaust represents is essentially a slaughter, a genocide of 6 million Jews, as well as all others. Right? We'll talk about all others here too. That Hitler essentially claimed were inferior, an inferior race of people. So in total, 10 to 11 million people were killed in the Holocaust. 10 to 11 million. That leaves a lot of room for other people other than simply um, the Jews. All right. So other people that are also part of this extermination plan by Hitler include gypsies. And they're an important group to know too. Gypsies are basically people from like Romania, Eastern Hungary, places like that. Uh, and for lack of a better term, they're generally regarded as the lower class peoples of Europe, almost like the hillbillies or the white trash of Europe, so to speak, for lack of a better term. And as horrible as what happened to the Jews was in the Holocaust, what happened to the Gypsies was equally disturbing. Uh, Even though there weren't as many killed, uh, as much as 80 to 90%, let's go ahead and say 90% of the Jewish population was killed. Uh, I'm sorry. Sorry about my phone there. I'm sorry. 80 90% of the Gypsy population was killed during the Holocaust. Sorry about that. I got thrown off there. So, anyway, going back to the Gypsies. So, 90% of the Gypsy population is killed and eradicated during the Holocaust. You don't hear as much about them is because it's a smaller population, especially considering nearly all of them, were exterminated as part of this, right? So next to the Jews, that's probably the second highest group. Uh, Other groups that Hitler targeted: homosexuals, Catholics, Jehovah's Witnesses, probably blacks and other ethnic minorities. Anybody who didn't fit into Hitler's ideal of a perfect Aryan person, and anybody who Hitler considered inferior. These people were rounded up, taken to either work camps or concentration camps, and were either forced to work during the period of the Nazi regime, or unfortunately, put to death. Other factors, um, Hitler went after political enemies, political dissidents, people that disagreed with his political ideals. When you are a totalitarian dictator, you produce a culture of fear around you. And one way to strengthen that culture of fear is to make sure people know that there's serious consequences for disagreeing with your ideologies. The whole beginning of the Holocaust, the date that everybody puts it down to, is November 9th, 1938, Kristallnacht, or what translates in English to the Night of Broken Glass. It was on this night in 1938 that the Germans, the SS stormtroopers and other German secret police and folks, stormed into Jewish neighborhoods, Jewish ghettos throughout Germany and other areas Germany controlled by then, and started rounding up Jewish people and breaking storefronts. That's where the broken glass comes, because they throw glass through storefronts or doors to homes and things. And they began rounding up Jews and arresting them for no other reason than these people were Jewish. And that was the beginning of what ultimately results in the Holocaust. Okay. At first, during the Holocaust, the main objective was not the killing of all the Jewish people. At first, they were sent to work camps, and at least a lot of them were sent to work camps or were given the opportunity to do work for the Nazi cause. As if you've seen Schindler's List or know anything about Schindler's List, the movie, he would basically buy up Jews to prevent them from going to the death camps, and would put them to work in his factories, saving the lives of over 1,000 during this time period. As the war went on, especially when things started to get worse, that's when we started to see the mass executions. When we started to see the mass executions of Jews and Gypsies and Jehovah's Witnesses and gays and people like that. But Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass here, basically the Nazis go into all these Jewish ghettos, these areas where Jewish people live, and arrest all the Jews for being Jewish. Now, ultimately, like we said here, Hitler decides, as the war starts to turn south, as the war is going worse and worse for Germany, he decides the only thing to do would be the total annihilation of the Jewish race, the final solution to the Jewish question, as Hitler called it. And it's at that time that the killing, and this is about 1942 or so, it's about at this time that the ramping up of the extermination of Jewish people really starts to happen, as Hitler orders through his people that any of the Jews that are rounded up need to go pretty much immediately to the death camps, and are sent ultimately to their death. Now, there's lots of concentration camps. There's a bunch of them. In fact, I'm going to show some to you on the next slide here. There's a few ones that are particularly significant or famous. I want to talk about those in a little more detail. Okay. Certainly the most well-known of all the camps was Auschwitz, right? Which is right here in Poland, Auschwitz-Birkenau. Now notice here, the one with the swastika are concentration camps. The ones with poison symbol there, those are killing centers. Simply what they were called. They were places where folks were taken to be put to death. Another thing that you should notice is that none of the killing centers are in Germany, right? They're all in Poland or pretty much all in Poland or areas around there. It's evidence that the Germans know what they were doing was bad, and understood that the horrors of what they were committing. But one way to conveniently ignore that is to make it somewhere where you're not actually there to see it. And that's why here in Poland, this is where we see all the death camps. Now, going back to speaking about a few of the most significant ones. Probably the most famous of all the camps is Auschwitz. If you go to Poland, you can still see it today. this was the most prolific in terms of the number of people killed. More people were killed, over 2 million, 2 to 3 million at Auschwitz than at any other camp. It was the Soviet Union that ultimately discovered it as they kind of invaded east towards the end of the war to take over Germany, invaded westward. They found the camp and liberated it, or liberated at least what was left of it. But the worst and most horrible of all the camps was certainly Auschwitz. The first one was a concentration camp. It was Dachau. This opened around 1934 and essentially was a camp that Hitler built for, or Hitler had built for political adversaries. Okay, this is where political adversaries of Hitler would be sent. This could be other political leaders, people that disagreed with him would be sent to Dachau. It wasn't as ruthless or as horrible as what you'd see in the killing centers, but still, it was still a place where people could get killed and exterminated. Now, by the end of the war, all these places here, there were orders to kill, anyone who was there. And as Allied troops came from the west and the Soviets came from the east, we discovered, they started to discover more and more these camps, and people were just shocked by the horror of them. Okay, a couple other important camps, and make sure you understand and you write these down because they're significant to the whole system. Another important one was Treblinka. Treblinka was one of the most frightening of all camps. At this one, and it burned down actually in a fire in 1942 when some experiments they were doing went bad and there was a fire, and that was that. But horrible experiments took place at Treblinka. The Nazis would use these tests on human subjects to see if they could do things such as use different chemicals to turn somebody's eyes blue, which of course would cause blindness in many. Horrible, just acts of atrocity that are much worse than simply changing somebody's eye colors. Testing new ammunition on live targets, or using new gases to see how effectively they would kill people. These are the sort of things that happened at Treblinka, and that's what made it such a horrifying place. One other camp that stands out as significant is one right near Treblinka, which is Sobibor, right here. And Sobibor stands out as the only camp during the war where there was ever a successful escape. There was a group of Jewish and Eastern European folks at Sobibor that managed to successfully escape from the camp and get away from the Nazis by escaping some into the Soviet Union, some north into Lithuania and areas, and other ones just south. Nowhere else was there ever a successful escape from a camp. And if you've ever seen the 1960 movie, The Great Escape, it's somewhat based on the success of the escape from Sobibor. And then in the 80s, they actually made a movie specifically about it called Escape from Sobibor. Other than that, a lot of the things you could imagine happened at these different camps, and were generally all just horrifying, terrible places. There's always been stories and speculation that the Allies knew about the camps before we found them. These stories, right before the war ended, these stories started to come about that these horrible things were taking place against populations in Europe, and the Nazis were responsible. And these stories were unconfirmed at the time. So as soldiers would, make their way into some of these camps and discover them, they really had no idea what it was they were walking into. And there's always been speculation that the Allied, that the higher ups in the Allies, like President Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and people like that, knew about what was going on. Well, the reality is probably much more this. There have been stories and intelligence, and we knew that something was probably happening. But the Allied powers decided if they would have tried to invade in here to liberate these people too early, it may have failed and would have jeopardized the whole war effort. So that would have been almost a surefire way to lose the war. It's also worth saying that even though there may have been some knowledge about some sort of camps involving um, Jews and other people, the severity of the camps people didn't have any idea about. So they were certainly much worse than anybody imagined. So make sure you know that kind of about it. The speculation as to whether or not we knew about it. Also, these four camps: Dachau, Auschwitz, Sobibor, and Treblinka are probably the four most prominent of any of the camps. So I'm going to show you a couple of photographs of some of the horrors that people discovered while liberating the camps, just dead bodies that people found. You can see how horrible that is as the different camps are being liberated. Just the malnourished bodies of dead prisoners laying in these chambers and these rooms in the camps. There were so many dying that the Nazis literally would dig these mass graves for the number of people that were killed, and would use bulldozers to push the bodies into these mass graves like this. This is how horrible the Holocaust really was. And these images, of course, are graphic, but it's important to see the reality and the sadness of what really a horrible atrocity this was for mankind. I really would much rather be able to discuss this and show you, these sort of things in class, but obviously we can't do that right now. But we'll stop there for today and, discuss this a little bit more, maybe in class on Thursday. Okay. All right, folks. We'll see you next time.